In 1944, the original GI Bill established a core national commitment. Veterans who served the country earned the resources to build their civilian lives through education and vocational training. Today, the execution of that promise rests with the Department of Veterans Affairs. It oversees billions of dollars distributed across thousands of educational institutions nationwide. Federal law recognizes the approval to train veterans and receive these funds as a property interest protected by the 14th Amendment, requiring specific legal safeguards before it can be removed. Federal regulations, specifically Title 38 of the Code of Federal Regulations, codify the VA's constitutional duty. If an application is incomplete or requires more evidence, the agency is mandated to provide clear written notice of the specific information needed and a timeline for response. The practical application of this law falls to a fragmented dual gatekeeping system shared between the federal VA and state-level state-approving agencies, or SAAs. This dual gatekeeping model operates through legacy regulations and specific financial screening templates. For many smaller vocational institutions, this administrative architecture produces immediate penalties for technical discrepancies. When these procedural gaps compound across state lines, they create a systemic barrier to due process, blocking veterans from accessing the high-demand career pathways they were promised. The idealized pipeline is simple. The school proves its curriculum to the SAA passes approval to the VA, and the government releases funding. But friction disrupts this node. The VA's delayed digital GI Bill deployment causes the entire approval pathway to stall. These back-end breakdowns leave school certifying officials, the frontline workers managing veteran benefits, operating blind. Without a comprehensive policy manual, they are forced to calculate complex variables like length of service and geographic housing allowances using incomplete data. This timeline reveals an administrative gap. Schools are held to a rigorous 30-day reporting window for enrollment changes, yet the VA averages 60 days to process these claims. The 30 days between the school's deadline and VA processing creates a paralyzed blackout period. For a vocational school with frequent rolling start dates, this delay prevents the certification of new veteran students. The veterans lose their housing allowances and tuition support, and the school takes a direct financial hit. By failing to provide timely administrative responses, the architecture strips institutions of their right to meaningful notice, leaving them unable to protect their operational standing. Vocational education has evolved. In fields like beauty and wellness, programs seamlessly combine digital theory instruction with hands-on, in-person clinic floors. The VA oversees modern programs using legacy regulations, forcing instruction into a strict binary. Courses are either scheduled resident training or student-led independent study. For non-college degree programs, any course categorized as independent study is strictly barred from receiving GI Bill approval. SAAs frequently classify any hybrid program as independent study, ignoring actual instructor interaction. While the VA acknowledges this is obsolete and proposes decoupling distance learning, the current state mechanism still forces modern hybrid models into this failing category. The impact of this modality trap is immediate. State agencies suddenly terminate GI Bill benefits for every veteran enrolled in a hybrid program, frequently giving the institution only 30 days to respond before the funding is severed. State regulators are effectively revoking constitutional property interests based on rigid enforcement of definitions the federal government itself admits poorly with modern instruction. By law, an institution must continuously demonstrate its financial soundness to maintain approval for veteran funding. Comparing metrics reveals a gap. The Department of Education uses a mathematically precise composite score, tracking student debt to institutional health. In contrast, the VA's internal aid B3 relies on a subjective checklist, flagging generic factors like student complaints or enrollment spikes. This simplistic template creates a paradox. Smaller vocational schools operating on debt-free models lack the traditional debt-to-equity ratios seen in massive for-profit chains, causing the VA's checklist to flag healthy institutions simply because their financials look different. In fact, Job Aid B3 instructs agents to code a 30% increase in student enrollment as a severe warning sign. A school successfully placing more veterans into jobs can be penalized for its own growth. When the Department of Education identifies a financial risk, it typically implements heightened cash monitoring, a structured reimbursement process. The VA, responding to its job aid triggers, moves directly toward total program suspension. The VA's current financial metrics create a subjective trap that threatens the survival of small, innovative schools while failing to provide a clear measure of actual institutional health. As the narrative shifts to the state level, vague federal directives and unvetted triggers intersect with the enforcement practices of local licensing boards. State agencies deploy targeted risk-based surveys against small schools, often providing as little as 24 hours of notice. These massive audits can be triggered by unsubstantiated complaints or issues the institution resolved years prior. The Kentucky State Board of Cosmetology serves as a prime case study of this administrative environment. Prior to the passage of Senate Bill 114, the board's conduct demonstrated the practical difficulty of accessing due process for beauty academies. Data reveals a severe due process accessibility gap. A cosmetologist's median annual income is roughly $35,000, while legal defense ranges from $14,000 to $25,000. Defending against unsubstantiated claims can consume 72% of a practitioner's gross earnings. Knowing practitioners cannot afford to defend themselves, boards can utilize the threat of these legal fees to coerce settlements. This process forces schools and professionals into signed agreements without the board ever having to prove the initial alleged violation. When the price of proving your innocence exceeds your total income, the constitutional right to a hearing is a legal nullity. State oversight transforms from a quality control mechanism into a tool of targeted suppression. We can now observe the full weight of the current approval pipeline. Notification failures, outdated modality definitions, and weaponized financial metrics have compounded, effectively choking the system. This friction creates an accountability gap, characterized by misdirected administrative priorities. State approving agencies expend immense resources penalizing fully compliant vocational programs over minor documentation discrepancies or outdated interpretations of independent study. Simultaneously, this same system allowed the Retail-Ready Career Center to defraud the government of $72 million and permitted the House of Prayer Bible seminaries to collect $22 million in federal funds despite glaring operational red flags. Repairing this system requires immediate federal regulatory action. The VA must finalize the amendments to 38 CFR 21.4200 and permanently decouple distance learning from independent study, ensuring the curriculum reflects modern educational reality. The agency must also replace the subjective Job Aid B3 template with rigorous, mathematically predictable oversight models, properly accounting for the stability of debt-free vocational institutions. At the state level, legislatures need to implement fee-shifting provisions. When state boards are required to pay the attorney fees of schools that prevail in administrative hearings, legal defense becomes economically viable, halting unchecked coercion. Evolving the GI Bill oversight requires a fundamental shift from reactive regulatory traps toward proactive, data-driven partnerships with the educators training the workforce. Resolving these administrative bottlenecks is the only path forward. The educational promise of the GI Bill depends on a fair, transparent pipeline, providing veterans unhindered access to the specialized, high-demand careers they have earned.